Hello friends, welcome to today's Christmas card tutorial. I'm Jeanette with Vivo Vintage Designs. In today's tutorial, I will be using watercolor to create a beautiful poinsettia. And I'm keeping this painting beginner friendly, so it's going to be very simple. I'm using Arches watercolor paper and my professional Winsor Newton paints. The brushes I'm using are a size 4 silver black velvet, and then a smaller size, I think it's a 1, just to define my edges a little bit here and there. So you can see here that I've created the petals and I've kept them very, very simple. I drew some circles in the middle, and then from those circles I drew the petals and the leaves as well. So to create this painting, I'm using the wet in wet technique. And the colors that I'm using are alizarin crimson. I have a mix of alizarin crimson and then alizarin crimson with a little cobalt blue. I also have cadmium yellow, perylene green, sap green, and hooker's green. So you can see that I put down my first layer of diluted alizarin crimson, and then I dropped in some straight alizarin crimson in a thicker consistency, and then in the center I used the mix of alizarin crimson and cobalt blue. Then I used a glass pen to create the veins inside the petals. And if you don't have a glass pen, you can use any object that you may have around the house that has a point. Even an old pen that no longer has any ink will do the same, will work just as well. So you can see, again, I put down the alizarin crimson as my base, and then I'm dropping in a heavier consistency of the alizarin crimson and the mix of alizarin crimson and the cobalt blue. Then I decided that I wanted to use the cadmium yellow as my base layer. So I'm wetting down the entire petal with a diluted mix of the cadmium yellow, and now I'm dropping in the heavier consistency of the alizarin crimson and the mix of alizarin crimson and cobalt blue. And I really think that that looked much better. I think it gave the petals a little bit more depth. So when you're creating these lines in your petals, excuse me, you can see how wet my paper is in this particular petal. And it's important that the petal be wet enough so that the color seeps into those crevices that you've created with the pen or whatever it is you're using. If you do it when the paper is damp, the paint won't flow into those crevices. So keep that in mind when you're doing this. And when you're using the wet and wet technique, you can see that I skip around because I don't want to start another petal where the petal next to it is still wet, because the paint will bleed into the previously painted petal if it's still wet. So make sure that you skip around and that you're not working near a wet petal. So here's where I use the smaller brush to define my edges a little bit more. And even while the petal was wet and after I did my lines, I dropped in a little bit more paint. And once all my petals were done and all dry, I did a little glazing with diluted alizarin crimson and some petals that I thought needed a little bit more color, because as you know, watercolor dries lighter than when you first apply it. I just wet down the entire leaf and dropped a little bit more color into it. You can see me doing that here. I wet down the entire leaf and I'm adding more of the alizarin crimson at the tip. But again, I'm making sure that I'm not working on petals that are still wet, next to petals that are still wet, that is. You can see how adding that little bit of glazing really brightened up the petals. So now I'm creating the leaves. And I started this particular leaf by wetting down the leaf with just plain water and then dropping in the perylene green and then either the sap green or the hooker's green here and there. And I think that at some point here I dropped in a little bit of the cadmium yellow. And while it was still wet, nice and wet, I used the glass pen to create the veins of the leaf. And while it's still damp, I can add a little bit more color. And now I decided that I want the same effect on the leaves as I had in the petals by using the diluted cadmium yellow first as my base, and then dropping in the different greens. I think the most fun of this painting is using the glass pen to create the veins. If you've never tried it before, give it a try. It's really a lot of fun and you can get carried away. So here I'm creating my last leaf using the same technique as I did on the others. And now I'm just wetting down the center of the flower and using a combination of the cadmium yellow and sap green. And then I'm using a heavy consistency of the cadmium yellow to create the little circles in the center of the flower. And although it appears like they're blending in, that's okay, because once it's dry, I will use a shadow mix of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue to accent those little circles. As you see me doing here, using a very small brush, I'm just doing kind of like a half circle underneath each of the circles to create a little shadow, and you can see how it defines each individual circle. And now using a white highlight pen, not a highlight pen, a gel pen, to add a little highlight. And although I have metallic watercolor paint and I was going to use that for my border, I found that using the Posca pen was so much easier. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you give this painting a try. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.